61, 68. I mean, it's just really unbelievable. How do you feel, though, about getting older?
I think it sucks.
She walked onto that stage the way she always does, chin lifted, voice steady, untouchable in the way only a handful of people on this earth have ever managed to look untouchable. The audience stood. The audience cheered. And for 90 seconds, nobody in that room knew that something was wrong. Not wrong with her voice. Not wrong with her face, still sharp, still unmistakable after 60 years under lights designed to find every flaw. Wrong somewhere else. Somewhere the cameras were never invited. Because while the world spent the last few years celebrating Cher, the Hall of Fame induction, the memoir, the headlines calling her ageless, something else was happening in the rooms behind all of it, something most of her fans still do not fully understand. And once you know what it is, you will not be able to watch her smile in those photographs the same way again. To understand what was really happening to Cher at 80, you cannot start with the woman the world thinks it knows. You have to start with a habit she built before she ever had a stage to stand on, a habit of looking composed while everything underneath her was shaking. That habit did not begin in a courtroom in 2026. It began in a much smaller room, decades earlier, when she was still just a child trying to keep her face still. Most people watching her sing this year had no idea that the same stillness she was performing on stage was a survival skill first, long before it was ever a stage skill. Nobody teaches a child to look calm while she is afraid. A child learns it on her own, usually because the alternative, falling apart where adults can see it, has already proven to make things worse, not better. Cher learned that lesson before she ever learned to read a contract, and she would go on practicing it for the rest of her life without anyone fully realizing what they were watching. She was born in El Centro, California in 1946, to a mother chasing a dream that never quite had room for a steady home, and a father who was rarely there to provide one. Georgia Holt loved her daughter fiercely and inconsistently, the way people love when they themselves were never given stability to copy from. For a stretch of that early childhood, when Georgia could not manage on her own, young Cher was placed temporarily in a Catholic institution, and there she learned her first lesson in composure. She learned to wait at a window without making a sound, watching for a mother who was not yet able to come for her, learning far too early that love and rescue are not always the same thing. There was no anger in that lesson, not yet, just a quiet, confusing arithmetic a small child should never have to solve, the sense that being loved and being safe could somehow be two entirely separate conditions. Georgia did eventually come back for her. But the part of Cher that had learned to stand very still at that window never fully unlearned the habit, and it would resurface, decades later, in places no one watching her career would think to look for it. That lesson followed her into a classroom where the letters on the chalkboard refused to behave the way teachers expected. Undiagnosed dyslexia turned ordinary lessons into daily proof, in the eyes of adults who did not know better, that she was simply not trying. She learned to sit through that humiliation with her face arranged into something acceptable. By 16 she had had enough of being misunderstood in rooms with her name on the attendance sheet, and she left for Los Angeles with no plan beyond the certainty that she could not stay where she was. It was there that the public story everyone thinks they know actually begins, and it is worth pausing on it, because it explains everything that came later about how thoroughly Cher learned to keep the cracks invisible. Sonny Bono was older, established, fluent in a business she had never been taught, and to a teenage girl with no money and no protection, he looked less like a stranger and more like a door swinging open. Through that door came I Got You Babe, a song that turned two unlikely faces into something the whole country could hum. It came a weekly television show that made their marriage into furniture in millions of living rooms. America did not just like Sonny and Cher. America memorized them, and in doing so, it built a frame so tight around Cher that for years almost no one could picture her standing in it alone. Inside that frame, the same skill she had built as a child at an orphanage window quietly went back to work. Audiences saw a confident, glamorous, endlessly entertaining young woman trading lines with her husband for the cameras. They did not see a wife learning, in real time, how much of her own career, her own money, and her own voice in the relationship she did not actually control. Composure again did the job it had always done. It let her keep performing while something else was happening underneath. By 1974 that frame was cracking, and in 1975 the marriage ended in public, the way almost nothing in her life had been allowed to end privately. She had to learn whether the audience had ever wanted her, specifically her, or only the act the two of them performed together. She did not get much time to find out quietly. Later that same year she married Gregg Allman, a southern rock voice as turbulent as her pop stardom was polished, and the relationship moved fast enough that the wound from the first marriage barely had time to close before a second one opened beside it. Their son, Elijah Blue Allman, was born in 1976, and his arrival gave the marriage a center it desperately needed and could not ultimately hold. Gregg was brilliant and magnetic and carrying private battles that made ordinary domestic life almost impossible to sustain. By 1979 that marriage was finished too, but a son does not finish when a marriage does. He remained the permanent thread connecting Cher's most unstable years to every year that followed. There was another son too, Chaz Bono, born during the marriage to Sonny, and raising two boys from two entirely different chapters of her life meant Cher spent decades learning, sometimes in full public view, that love for a child does not arrive finished. It has to be built, corrected, rebuilt, and built again, often while the rest of the world is busy watching her sing on a stage and assuming the woman up there has nothing harder waiting for her at home. With Chaz, that learning took its own painful, public shape over the years, full of moments that required humility she had never been asked to perform in front of cameras before. With Elijah, the difficulty followed a quieter, more private path, one most of the public would not glimpse until decades later, in a courtroom neither of them ever wanted to be standing in. This is the part of the story most retrospectives skip past quickly, on their way to the parts with better lighting, the film career, the Oscar, the unstoppable reinvention. But it is the part that actually explains the year Cher just lived through, the year the headlines have not fully caught up to yet. Through the late 70s and into the 80s, Cher fought to be seen as something more than half of a famous couple, something more than a costume the industry had grown tired of. Silkwood gave her real dramatic weight. Mask gave her tenderness inside Grit. Then came Moonstruck, an Oscar, and a black feathered gown on the red carpet that refused, on principle, to let anyone shrink her down to a size that made them more comfortable. The trophy did not erase the years of being underestimated. It simply stood behind her as proof the doubt had been wrong. That trophy also taught her something she would lean on again and again, the lesson that recognition does not arrive on a schedule of fairness. It arrives late, often after the hardest years are already behind a person, and a smart performer learns not to wait for it before continuing to do the work. Cher absorbed that lesson early, and it would steady her through every decade that followed, including the one nobody expected her to still be standing in. In the late 90s she did something almost unheard of for a woman her age in this industry. She turned a vocoder effect into the defining pop sound of an era, and Believe carried a woman past 50 to the top of the charts singing about heartbreak in a voice that sounded like it had traveled through time. The world called it a comeback. Comebacks assume an ending came before them, and Cher's life had never agreed to stay finished at anything. That same period handed her a goodbye she could not negotiate. Sonny Bono died in a skiing accident in 1998, and Cher stood at his funeral with no script, no studio audience, no familiar rhythm to lean on. The man who had opened the very first door of her career was now beyond any future conversation, any apology, any clarity either of them might have eventually offered each other. She kept her composure that day too, the way she always had, because by then composure was not a performance choice anymore. It was the only language she had left for grief. Reporters at the funeral would later describe her as remarkably poised. None of them could have known how old that particular kind of poise actually was, or how far back it had been built. The recognition kept arriving after that, formal rooms standing in for all the chaotic ones earlier. The Kennedy Center honors in 2018. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2024, the same year she published a memoir that finally let her describe her own life from the inside instead of having it narrated by other people's headlines. A return to Saturday Night Live in 2025 that looked, from every camera angle available, like a living argument against disappearing, the kind of appearance that gets clipped and shared for weeks, proof offered to an entire generation that she had not slowed down, had not softened, had not stepped quietly into the background the way the industry has historically expected women her age to do. And this is exactly where the mystery we opened with finally has its answer, because everything you just heard, every award, every headline calling her ageless, was happening at the very same time something else was quietly falling apart in a part of her life the cameras were never pointed toward. By 2023, concerns about Elijah Blue Almond's well-being had grown serious enough that Cher pursued a conservatorship connected to his finances and his health, an extraordinary step for any parent to take against an adult child, the kind of decision a mother does not make unless every gentler option has already failed. That filing was eventually withdrawn after a private agreement, the sort of quiet resolution every family hopes will actually hold. Think about the timeline for a moment, because this is where the mystery we opened with actually resolves. While that filing was moving through the courts, Cher was still showing up to public events looking, by every visual measure available to a camera, entirely unbothered. The same composure she had built standing at an orphanage window as a child was carrying her through red carpets while her son sat in a psychiatric facility 2,000 miles away. Nobody in those photographs could see that distance. That has always been the cost of the skill she learned so young. It works. It simply does not show its receipts. On April 24, 2026, a Los Angeles judge denied the temporary request, ruling there was not sufficient immediate urgency in that moment, though the denial came without prejudice, leaving the door open for the matter to return to court later. For a woman who has spent 6 decades being underestimated and proving people wrong on her own timeline, that ruling landed differently. This was not an industry doubting her talent. This was a legal system telling a frightened mother that her fear, however real, did not yet meet the threshold the law required. So here is what was actually happening underneath that stage performance we opened with. While fans were watching her sing, watching her accept honors, watching her look, by every visual measure, untouched by time, Cher was also quietly walking in and out of courtrooms, fighting for a son who could not yet be reached, carrying a fear no amount of applause could absorb. The radiant photographs were real. The fear behind them was real too. Both of those things were true on the same afternoon, sometimes within the same hour, and almost nobody watching from the outside could tell which one they were looking at. That is the gap fame creates and rarely gets credit for creating, the gap between the version of a person built for an audience and the version that exists when the audience goes home. Cher built her entire career on the ability to close that gap when she needed to walk onto a stage carrying private weight and somehow leave the weight at the curtain. For 60 years that skill made her seem indestructible. In 2026, it simply meant the people who loved her from a distance had no idea how much she was actually carrying. There is a particular kind of loneliness reserved for parents of struggling adult children, a loneliness fame does not exempt anyone from and arguably makes heavier, because the public expects composure precisely when the private world is collapsing. Cher can fill an arena with her voice. She cannot fill the silence of a phone that refuses to ring when she needs it to. She can eventually win a courtroom argument. She cannot win her son's choices for him. Money opens almost every door this industry has. It does not open the one door that matters most right now, the one only Elijah himself can walk through. Other parents living through something similar will recognize this particular shape of helplessness immediately, the strange guilt of having every resource in the world and still not being able to purchase the one outcome that actually matters. Cher has spent 6 decades being told that enough money, enough fame, enough sheer force of will could fix almost anything in her life. This is the first chapter that has quietly, firmly refused to obey that rule, no matter how many lawyers, how many filings, how many sleepless nights she puts against it. It would be easy to end this story there, in that bleakness, but Cher's history resists easy endings the way it always has. In recent years she also helped fund the rescue of Coven, an elephant held in lonely captivity for decades, a cause she pursued with the same stubborn force she has applied to every chapter of her own life. A woman who once watched the world through the glass of an institution as a child grew into a woman who used her resources to break another captive creature out of confinement. That is not coincidence. That is pattern. When Cher cannot fix something completely, she finds something within reach and refuses to stop pushing until the door gives way. That same instinct is still driving her now, even though this particular door has not opened on her schedule. She filed again. She will likely keep filing, keep showing up, keep doing whatever the law allows her to do, because the one constant beneath every version of Cher the public has ever watched is a refusal to treat a closed door as final. So if you came here wondering what happened to Cher at 80, here is the honest answer. Nothing happened to her talent. Nothing happened to her resolve. What happened is that the woman who spent 60 years being told she was too much, too bold, too old to last, finally met an opponent her fame cannot intimidate and her willpower cannot simply outwork, her own son's pain, and the unbearable limits of what a mother is actually allowed to do about it from the outside. She is still indestructible, just not in the way the headlines mean it. Indestructible was never about staying untouched. It was always about what she did the moment after being touched, after the door closed, after the room went quiet. She kept the composure. She also kept fighting behind it. Both at once, every single day, for longer than most of us have been alive to notice. And maybe that is the real story hiding inside every one of those radiant photographs from this year, the SNL appearance, the Hall of Fame stage, the memoir tour smiling out from every screen. Not a woman who has nothing left to worry about. A woman who has spent 80 years perfecting the art of carrying worry somewhere the camera will never quite reach, while still walking forward, still showing up, still refusing to let the worst chapter of any year become the only chapter anyone remembers. That is not the absence of pain. It is something far rarer than that, and far harder to fake for 60 straight years. If this changed the way you see her, say so in the comments, and tell someone who still thinks her story ended with an Oscar and a comeback song. Subscribe for more real stories behind the legends America thought it already understood.